Hi, this is going to be a very short video on nature and nurture. We've already covered the main components of it in the first year when we talked about gender, so this is really just a little bit of a top-up for you and introducing a few of the things that we can talk about or things to be aware of in the second year. We'll do it a lot more in the second year. It comes in into a lot of things such as your personality, what makes people into criminals, your kind of childhood attachments to parents, mental illness. So it comes in all those different areas. So we'll really expand on this next year. But at the moment, this should be a fairly swift video. If you're looking at the YouTube link now and it says like there's 120 minutes of this video or something, you know that I've went off on a lot of tangents and a lot of it won't be relevant. But I'm going to try and keep it short, ideally under about 10 minutes. So let's try this then. So you already should have a concept of what nature and nurture is. Your nature is anything biological. Your genetics, your brain structure, central nervous system. And your nurture is the effects of the environment or the effects of other people on you. The issue comes in psychology and in science in general about how do we separate these things. Trying to figure out what is nature and what is nurture. And what is a bit of both. And mostly we fall into the end category, everything is a bit of both really. Some things are more nature and some things are more nurture. In the exam you're going to have to be able to outline the ideas that something is nature and something is nurture. For example, gender. Showing both sides of the argument and trying to reach some sort of balance between them. So nature, again, obvious thing, the influence of your genetics on who you are, your behaviour. So we talked about in the first year genotypes and phenotypes. So your genotype is like your genetic makeup, the structure of genes that you have. For example, you may have the genes for a brown eye and a blue eye, the brown eyed and the blue eyed gene, but then you don't show that because the brown eye gene is dominant. So again, this gets into the whole recessive and dominant thing that we talked about in the first year, and you should know. But basically, for what you need to know, the nature side of the argument is it's your biology, your brain and your genetics. And what I'm going to do is, as we go through this, I'll talk about a few examples. So, for example, there are theorists out there who think your personality, which we've studied in the lesson on is psychology of science, is due to your genetics or your biology, and there are others who think that's due to your environment. In the class on nature nurture, we're going to have a go at this. We're going to see if we can come to some sort of agreement on which one we think is more influential. So the nurture is the role of the environment. So we're talking about the social interactions you make with people. So as I said, some people think your personality is due to your biology, due to a particular gene, or due to the structure of your brain and how much chemical your brain releases. And that's one of the theories that we'll look at in the second year. Whereas other people, like learning theorists, talk about obviously how positive reinforcement, social learning theory, things like that will shape your behavior. So nurture, anything that is external, anything that's postnatal, or anything that acts on a passive individual from the outside. So your environment or your nurture comes from lots of different places. You probably can't see this diagram very clearly, but it talks about some of the different ways that the environment can affect you. And the thing is, it even affects your biology. So once you've been conceived, the amount of stress level that your mother experiences during pregnancy will affect your behavior and your biology. We found that people are more likely to be schizophrenic if their mother, for example, got the flu when she was pregnant. It also looks at things like your school environment, your family environment. So if we talk about kind of sociology, that would be your primary and secondary socialization. So we'll be looking at all these things again, as I say, with particular focus on what makes people turn to crime. Your environment has a lot of effects on you that you might not even realize. So some of us looked in the first year when we talked about animal experiments at this study by Blakemore and Cooper. So what they did was they put a cat in a box and that had either vertical or horizontal lines. And for its kind of period of time when it was growing up, so from its birth through so many months, that's all it saw, either vertical or horizontal lines. And what they found is when they took the cat out of that environment, it was unable to process information given it in a different way. So cats who were raised in a box full of vertical lines, like this one in the picture, were unable to see any horizontal surfaces or any horizontal lines given to them. It seemed, and this was a kind of revolutionary idea at the time, that the environment that you were part of or that you grew up in shifted and shaped your perceptions. Another example of this, if you can research him a bit more if you want, is, I believe he was called Mike May, was a championship skier who was blinded in the youth. He was blind for 43 years, and then doctors figured out a way to give him his sight back. And once they gave him his sight back, he found the world to be a very confusing place. He got used to the idea that corridors, for example, were the walls always stayed at the same distance. But perception obviously makes you see them converge in the distance. And his brain couldn't process that information anymore. So he kept thinking corridors were getting narrower and narrower. Other things, he had an inability to identify males and females by their faces. He could not tell them apart because it was a learned process. Now, this is something that we had not anticipated. We thought that these sort of things were a natural biological process, but it turns out that they are actually influenced by the environment. Moving on, so again we look at these with twin studies and adoption studies. Those should be something that you know from the first year. There's a quick sentence summary of how those two types of studies work. Again, we'll look at that more in the second year as well. So the problem with nature-nurture is how complicated and intricate it actually is. As I was saying earlier on, you can't really separate nature and nurture, though we try because we need to find out whether it's something is more nature or more nurture to know about whether it is possibly changeable, the way to change that. So if your gender is purely biological and environment plays no factor in it, then we don't need to worry about sexist stereotypes on television, and we don't need to worry about what toys we give to children or how we treat them. Whereas if it is due to the environment, we do. And we need to be able to look at both sides of this argument and figure out which one is true. But the problem becomes that this is such a complicated thing. For example, your nature and nurture interact with each other. There's no way around it. And Proman in 1977 identified 3 ways that this could happen. It could be a passive relationship. So relationships between genes and environment may occur because parents transmit genes that promote certain traits and also construct the rearing environment. So we're going to stick to this example of musical ability all the way through. So if we assume that your musical ability is genetic, this is something you could research by the way, we can assume that if you have a musical talent, it's because your parents have the genes for a musical talent. If they have the genes for a musical talent, it may very well mean that they bring you up in a musical environment. They sing or they play instruments, things like that. So both your genes and the environment are pushing you in the direction of being good at music. It could be an active relationship. So active relationships are when your genes and the environment occur. The active relationship occurs because individuals actively select experiences that fit in with their genetically influenced preferences. So if you are musically gifted genetically, you may seek out musically gifted friends, or you may go seek out musically gifted environments, or you may decide that you want to learn an instrument. I am totally tone deaf and have avoided learning instruments my entire life, whereas if I had some sort of genetic predisposition, I may have went and practiced for hundreds of hours and be really good at music. The problem becomes then we can't pull apart whether it is the biological cause, the genetics that said I was going to be better than average at music, or all of the environmental factors in practice which pushed me onwards. And that also works kind of in reverse as well. So we've got reactive relationships. This is a relationship between genes and environment which occurs because genetically distinct individuals evoke different reactions in those around them. So if you are musically gifted at school, your teachers will treat you differently. Yeah, you may have to go for extra lessons, or they may treat you more positively, things like that. And that's going to make you act differently as well. So again, we can't pull apart genes and environment. Your genes may cause your environment to change. Then, obviously, we talked about in the first year briefly, my class, about epigenetic factors. Yeah, your environment can also cause your genes to change. Not just your biology like your brain, but your very genes. So if we've got a set of identical twins, one of them exercises, eats right, and does all things like that, and the other one doesn't. They sit around, they eat pizza and chips and things like that, and they've never seen the inside of a gym in their life. By the time they get to around 30, their genetic structures might look very different in some places. For example, their metabolism will have shifted. So that's what that epigenetic factor looks at. Again, the problem is true with IQ as well. So this study in 2003 looked at the effects of the environment on your IQ. And what we found is in poor children, in children who did not have much money in their family, children who were of low working class background, etc., the genetic factor and how intelligent they were was very low. So we could have a child whose parent had a very high IQ but was born into poverty, and another one whose parent was average or below average, born into poverty. And that child was born into poverty, and because both children were born in poverty, their IQs as they grew older didn't really change or were very similar to each other. The genetics that they'd inherited from their parents had a very minimal influence on them. However, if a child is born into a wealthy background, then the genetics was a massive influence. So again, that child whose parent was, say, low IQ but was very wealthy for whatever reason, their child would have lower IQ than someone who was very wealthy and their parents were geniuses. Yeah. So how much your genetics influence your behavior is partially influenced by the environment. So again, this nature-nurture debate is very difficult. What we're going to look at, and I'm going to get you to do some research for the lesson, is things like gender, intelligence, turning to crime. So again, how much you are likely to be a criminal based on your genetics and your environment. Aggression, personality, sexuality, all of these things we've researched, nature and nurture, and I'm going to give you the task. It's probably going to be one of the very few tasks I give you for this lesson to research that topic. Right, so see you in class. Thanks for listening. Bye.